impulses and their physical manifestations, taking up a spiritual path. Today I would like to add some comments to what I said in previous lectures about the task of anthroposophy now and in the future development of humanity. In particular, I want to consider the perspective we get when we look at how Friedrich Nietzsche led the philosophy of the 19th century into absurdity. We can show that Nietzsche, more than anyone else, demonstrates that the anthroposophical view of human beings and the world is an historical necessity in human evolution. I do not want to repeat what I have already said about Nietzsche, both here and elsewhere in the anthroposophical movement. Rather, I want to talk about two influences on his philosophy that I have not yet talked about. Throughout his life, Nietzsche was preoccupied with forming an opinion about the nature and value of moral impulses in human beings. He was a moral philosopher in the true sense of the word. He wanted to get a clear idea of the origin and significance of morality, both for the individual and for the whole cosmic order. In his striving for clarity on this issue, two elements run like a red thread through his whole life, a life that changed considerably in many other respects. The first of these factors is that beginning with the turning point in his second year at the university, until the end of his life, Nietzsche basically had an atheistic outlook, which remained unchanged through all the transformations of his philosophy. The second factor is that in regard to the moral, intellectual, and practical impulses of his time, he asserted that one virtue was the most important, namely honesty. Honesty with oneself, with others, and with the world as a whole. He considered honesty the most essential virtue modern people needed to have both inwardly in their own soul and outwardly in the world. Nietzsche once listed 4 cardinal virtues he considered most important for human life. Honesty with oneself and others was first on his list. The other 3 were courage toward one's enemies, magnanimity to those one has defeated, and courtesy to everyone. These 4 cardinal virtues can ultimately be reduced to the first, which Nietzsche considered a kind of necessary virtue of the times. They are all contained, so to speak, in honesty. We can say that there is a relationship between this virtue of honesty and his atheism. Nietzsche was first and foremost a child of his time. Even at a superficial glance, we see that he was rooted in Schopenhauer's worldview, which was also an atheist outlook, and at least in the first period of his life, he saw Richard Wagner's musical dramas as the artistic expression of Schopenhauer's worldview. Then Nietzsche took up the scientific positivism of the times, that is, the philosophy that believes the whole world is built up exclusively from what is directly perceptible to the senses. For positivism, the sense-perceptible world is the only standard for developing a philosophy. In this third period, Nietzsche achieved a certain independence through assimilating the modern idea of evolution, which he elaborated and applied to human beings by developing the positivist ideal of the evolution of the human being into Superman. Thus Nietzsche's views grew out of various cultural currents of his time. Investigating how his views developed will also reveal important aspects of the character of the last third of the 19th century. We have to ask why Nietzsche became an atheist. His atheism developed out of his honesty, his inner honesty. After all, with holy zeal and complete honesty, Nietzsche took in everything he could of the knowledge the 19th century had to offer. He had to admit that honestly accepting the outlook of the 19th century would not lead him to the divine. Therefore he felt he had to eliminate God from his thinking. This marks the first major conflict between Nietzsche and his age. As a result, he became a rebel against his times. Nietzsche saw that most people who had adopted the knowledge and outlook of the 19th century also believed in a divine world order. To Nietzsche, this was dishonest. It seemed to him dishonest to look at the world from the prevailing point of view of that time and at the same time to assume the existence of a deity. Since he was still expressing himself in the formulas typical for 19th century thought, Nietzsche did not actually say what he instinctively felt about the 19th century worldview. He felt the 19th century looked at the world just as it does at the human organism when it has become a corpse. If you believe, so to speak, in this dead organism, if you think it has an inner reality, then, if you are honest, you cannot also believe that this organism has a meaning only when it is filled with a living and souled and spiritual human being. When we examine a corpse, we really should admit that what we see and examine there is not, strictly speaking, a reality. It is a reality only when it is filled by the human spirit. It needs the human spirit, but this spirit is no longer there in the corpse. Although Nietzsche did not say it in so many words, he thought that looking at nature in the way modern knowledge does is treating it as a corpse. He felt people should realize that nature, as they see it, no longer contains anything divine. If we are going to accept this view of nature as absolute and speak of nature only in terms of its laws, then we obviously must deny that it has a divine foundation. For according to this view, nature has just as little a divine foundation as a corpse has human spirit in it. This is what lived in Nietzsche's soul. Nevertheless, the 19th century worldview had such a strong influence on him that he came to believe that nature is all we have, that modern times have taught us not to have anything else. If we adhere to this knowledge of nature, we must reject God. Thus Nietzsche considered it dishonest to believe in God and at the same time accept modern knowledge. In this regard, the life of his soul is extremely interesting, precisely because he strove to be so absolutely honest. To believe in God and at the same time accept the prevailing view of nature was, in Nietzsche's eyes, the great lie of 19th century culture. Still, he took seriously the natural order that was generally accepted. In fact, he realized that modern life had developed to the point where people adopted this view of nature as a matter of course. It is not that nature had compelled people to accept this order of things, rather life had become such that this was the only view of nature it could bear. The prevailing view of nature had actually developed out of life itself, yet Nietzsche felt this life was utterly dishonest, and he strove for honesty. He had to admit that if we live in this order and consider it true, then within the framework of this truth we can never become aware of our humanity. Nietzsche's fundamental feeling in the first period of his life was doubt about how he could feel himself a human being when he was confined by the prevailing view of the natural order. The truth, as he saw it, kept him from reaching awareness of his own humanity. That was how Nietzsche felt, and therefore he reached the conclusion in this first period of his life that if he could not live in the realm of truth and reality, he would have to live in that of appearances, in poetry, in art. Nietzsche believed he had found in the ancient Greeks the nation that had arrived at the same dissatisfaction with the truth out of a certain naivete, and had therefore consoled itself with appearances, with beauty. He expressed this in his first work, titled The Birth of Tragedy and the Genealogy of Morals, which is like a hymn and written very beautifully. He wanted to say that when we are in the realm of reality, we can never be aware of our humanity. Therefore, we should flee from that realm into the one where we can create a world that does not conform to reality. In this world of poetry, we will find consolation for what reality can never give us. According to Nietzsche, the ancient Greeks had been genuine, naive pessimists who felt that they could not be satisfied with the world of reality. That is the main reason why they created their wonderful tragedies, a world of beautiful illusions, to find there what would satisfy them. Nietzsche believed that Wagner's musical dramas were a renewal of this world of beautiful illusions, and had been created for the express purpose of leading people from the so-called real world into that of appearances, so they could find satisfaction as human beings. Nietzsche thought it was impossible to deepen our study and knowledge of the sensory world, and move from the outer revelation to the divine within nature, in order to feel ourselves connected with the divine and to feel ourselves as human beings, as real in the world. Nietzsche could not take that approach. He was determined to be honest. And in his honesty, he saw no way to arrive at such an approach on the basis of what the 19th century had to offer. Thus he had to stay with the other approach. There is no satisfaction for us in all of reality. Therefore let us find satisfaction in an unreal world. Nietzsche's earliest attitude toward the world can be compared to that of beings who land on another planet where they find only corpses. Regarding the corpses not as remains of a reality, but as a reality in themselves, because the souls that once filled these dead bodies are no longer present, these beings then proceed to make up for their consolation fictitious entities to ensoul the corpses. Basically, Nietzsche's writings, following his title, The Birth of Tragedy, for example, title David Strauss, the Confessor and Writer, title On the Uses and Disadvantages of History for Life, title Schopenhauer as Educator, and title Richard Wagner in Bayreuth, were confrontations between the dishonesty of his time and his own honesty. Though it had no way out of the sensory realm into the spirit, Nietzsche's age still talked about spirit. Though its knowledge did not really include anything divine, that age still talked about God. In fact, in Nietzsche's time, the prevailing view was that in earlier ages people had accepted the illusion of a God, but the study of nature had since revealed that God did not exist, but, oh, well, there were concerts and music instead. This Philistine point of view was set forth in one chapter of David Friedrich Strauss's book titled The Old and the New Faith. Nietzsche was particularly annoyed about this chapter, so he wrote an article against Strauss, a relatively excellent man, labeling him a Philistine. In this article, Nietzsche explained that people either are dishonest in still assuming the existence of God, or they sink to the level of the banal and Philistine, as David Friedrich Strauss did. However, then followed the second period in Nietzsche's life. He remained true to himself in regard to his atheism and his insistence on honesty. Still, in the earlier period, he had accepted ideals, albeit aesthetic ones. He had found them a solace against the reality our outer senses present to us. However, in the second period, Nietzsche clung more strongly to the one and only thing that, according to the prevailing opinion of his time, the world could reveal. He had to admit that regardless of our devotion to ideals, they are undoubtedly born out of our physical nature. People lead themselves to believe in all kinds of beautiful things, but their ideals and beauty are only all too human. This was the beginning of the time in Nietzsche's life when he became especially aware of human weaknesses, the all-too-human, our surrender to our physical nature. Since Nietzsche took the prevailing view of nature seriously, he had to realize that people cannot help but surrender to their physical nature. In fact, at one time he said, quote, 3 cheers for the physical. Let us cheer even more the honesty in our faith in the physical, end quote. In the second phase of his life, Nietzsche said roughly, let us be honest, and let us realize that even the most beautiful and idealistic thought we might have is still nothing more than an emanation from our physical nature. Therefore, let us approach human life not by describing the smoke coming out at the top, but by looking at the fuel causing the smoke. And then we will arrive not at the idealistic divine, but at the human, all too human. In a sense, then, Nietzsche killed every idealistic striving in life because he wanted to be honest with himself and others. He concluded that what people usually call soul is really only a lie. It is actually based on the bodily organization, and the effects of this organization manifest in such a way that we call them soul. According to Nietzsche, the fact that some of his contemporaries were reading writers such as Voltaire was an indication of true enlightenment. True enlightenment for him meant that people would stop getting themselves entangled in some kind of an illusory world to transcend reality, and instead would look at the physical nature of reality and see that everything moral originates there. The most striking feature of the third period in Nietzsche's life is the extreme to which he took his honesty, probably out of his, by now, highly pathological condition. For example, He claimed that if we take our modern knowledge of nature and its laws seriously, then we have to admit that the spirit supposedly living in us is nothing else than a mere emanation from our physical nature. Therefore, the perfect human being is the one whose physical body is the most perfect in comparison to other parts of the person. In other words, the perfect human being, according to Nietzsche, is one whose physical nature is such that the strongest instincts live in him. Nietzsche believed the intellectual life, rather than the life of soul and spirit, would lead us beyond ourselves in our evolution, because the instincts, though remaining just instincts, nevertheless would become stronger and stronger, grow beyond the level of animal instincts, and then the human race would develop into Superman. Why did Nietzsche first admit that human beings needed the illusion of ideals, then unmask these ideals as emanating from the physical, and then postulate that the human race would evolve into Superman through a higher development of its physical nature, its instinctual life? He was led to this because he thought people steeped in the worldview of the 19th century could not possibly understand the physical and yet go beyond it and remain honest at the same time. If they wanted to be honest, they had to stay within the realm of the physical. Nietzsche then cultivated a strict honesty and completely committed himself with his whole being to the physical realm. Indeed, his ideal for the future of human civilization, if we can call it an ideal, was that human beings would throw light on the grand illusion of having a spirit. People usually are not aware of this background of Nietzsche's views. After all, he worked his way out of all this with the greatest possible honesty by denying the existence of spirit so spiritedly and glorifying the spiritual poverty of humanity so brilliantly and ingeniously. Within the framework of the worldview of the 19th century, it was impossible to be a moral philosopher, as Nietzsche had become because of his predisposition, if this worldview was accepted honestly and seriously. For if we can no longer say that our task on earth is to bring a spiritual, super-earthly element into this earthly world, but believe that we have to confine ourselves to this earthly realm, then we will have no justification for setting up moral standards. If we accept the 19th century worldview in all honesty, then morality becomes a free-for-all. And Nietzsche really felt deeply that morality had become a free-for-all. He wanted to be a moral philosopher, but where was he to get moral impulses from? That was the big question. If we see the supersensible illuminating human beings, then morality is what this supersensible element demands of our sensory existence. Then morality is possible. However, if we see nothing supersensible in human beings, as the 19th century worldview did not, there is no source from which we might draw moral impulses. To distinguish between good and evil, we need the supersensible. Thus Nietzsche groped his way through human life to find a source or origin of moral impulses. For example, he looked at the history of human civilization and found that strong races conquered weaker people, forcing their standards and norms on these weaker ones. Out of their instincts, the conquerors ordered the defeated people to do this or that. Nietzsche, of course, could not believe in any categorical imperative or moral rules. He could only believe in a race of people of instinct, who saw themselves as good and others as bad, inferior people whose actions and standards they could dictate. Then those who, according to the conquerors, were the inferior people, in turn ganged up and conquered the former, not with the older brutal means, but with the more subtle weapons of the soul and spirit, with cunning and ingenuity. Now they in turn called the former conquerors bad, because they had been conquerors, despots, muscle men, and militaristic people. On the other hand, the new victors called themselves good. Formerly they had been considered inferior and bad. To hold one's own in weakness and defeat, in spite of being poor, restricted, oppressed, and vanquished, that is good. To conquer and defeat others, that is evil. Thus good and evil developed out of good and bad. However, good and bad did not yet smack of moral judgments as they do now, but merely carried a suggestion of conquering powerful and aristocratic people, in contrast to the army of slaves, who were considered inferior and bad people. Our distinction between good and evil derives merely from the slave revolts of those who had formerly been bad and inferior, and now called the others criminals and evil, and were taking revenge for what had been done to them. Thus, the morality later expressed in the categories good and evil seemed to Nietzsche to be nothing more than the revenge of the oppressed on their former oppressors. He could find no inner justification for morality. He could only place himself outside the framework of good and evil, not inside it. For to find an inner justification for the categories good and evil, he would have had to reach out to the supersensible. However, to him the supersensible was a delusion, nothing but the expression of our weak human nature, refusing to admit that our true being is limited to the physical. We could say that all thinking people of Nietzsche's time would have had to agree with him if they had been as honest as he. Nietzsche had made it his goal to be completely honest. That is why he became a rebel against his time and had such sharp mental weapons. That is also the reason why he was striving for a transvaluation of all values. To him, the values by which he lived had developed out of dishonesty. Through work done over centuries, the modern scientific concepts had been established and been introduced into history. Yet those same centuries had not taken out of human souls what could not be reconciled with these scientific concepts, namely ideas about morality and God. Values had developed that now needed to be transvalued. Nietzsche's life was really a terrible tragedy. I don't think it is possible to understand human civilization in the last third of the 19th century, or its lingering effects on the 20th century, without having at least some insight into this tragedy that took its course in a soul living through that time, a soul such as Nietzsche's. It is really true that all the breakdown we are experiencing now can be seen as a consequence of what Nietzsche called the dishonesty of modern civilization. We could say that Nietzsche became a rebel against his time because he felt that the continuation of this dishonesty would lead to a destructive battle involving all peoples belonging to this modern civilization. Indeed, the tragedy of Nietzsche's life developed because he was looking for the basis of morality, but the education and culture of his time made him unable to find it. He could not find a source from which to draw moral impulses. Thus he groped his way through life, and in the process hurt his fingers. Out of the pain he suffered, he described his time the way he did. Nietzsche was searching for something that cannot be found in the sensory realm, but only in the supersensible. After all, you can come up with ever so beautiful, grand, and lofty ideals, yet you cannot fuel an engine, turn a wheel, or start an electric motor with them. When we focus only on what can fuel an engine, start an electric motor, or turn a wheel, we will never understand how the moral impulses living in us can possibly affect our organism. You see, no matter how lofty our ideals, they are, after all, only smoke and mist. For there is no way they can intervene in a muscle, improve any of our skills or the like. We cannot see moral ideals intervening in the organic realm anywhere in the sensory world. Nietzsche could not help realizing that when we come up with ever so beautiful ideals and keep them in our heads, we are treating our organism just as we would a machine. As far as machines are concerned, we can write the words moral ideals on posters. They will still not fuel the machines nor make them move. Nevertheless, we move. And if we are as natural science sees us, are we then moving in accordance with our moral ideals? Compared to reality, our ideals are lies. The effective person is not the one who is devoted to ideals, but the one who fuels his or her engine so that the instincts become more powerful, the blonde beast, as Nietzsche put it. These were the problems Nietzsche had to face when confronting a human race that could have been moral, according to his definition, only if the moral impulses had been able to intervene in them. They had not been able to, and therefore there was neither good nor evil, only title beyond good and evil. Now remember that we have always described the modern knowledge of the world as unable to really understand the human being. It cannot arrive at a clear picture or idea of the human being. Through our experiencing life in our souls in accordance with this modern worldview, we cannot come close to knowing the human being. Yet everything in Nietzsche was directed to the human being. Everything was aimed at something he could not reach. In addition, he wanted to lead the human being to develop into Superman, in accordance with the modern idea of human evolution. However, he had not really grasped the human being. Of course, he could not possibly have shown how something he did not have was to develop into Superman. According to Nietzsche, the human being as such did not exist in terms of idea, perception, feeling, or will impulse, and Superman necessarily even less so. It was as though he had said the words human being and Superman only out of an old habit, and was now choking on them because they had no content, just as one would suffocate in an airless room. Nietzsche was faced with the necessity of entering the supersensible world with his moral problems, but he was unable to do so. That was his inner tragedy, and that is also what makes him a representative of the late 19th century. As a representative soul of that age, he indicated that human beings have to enter into the supersensible world if they want to remain honest and not declare moral ideals mere lies. Nietzsche became insane because he was faced with the need to enter the supersensible world but could not do so. Of course, there are many people who do not become insane, but I will not go into the reasons why they don't at this point. After all, even in the description of peculiarities of our civilization, we must not overstep the boundaries of courtesy. Still, we can see one thing clearly about Nietzsche's life. Modern people can be honest with themselves and others only if they enter the supersensible world. In other words, we cannot maintain honesty and sincerity in a worldview that is not supersensible. By the same token, we will not find the way from the human being to the Superman if we cannot take the path from the sensory world to the supersensible one. If morality in a certain sense belongs to the Superman, then it demands that we look for this Superman not in the sensory world, but in the supersensible one. Otherwise, the term Superman is merely an empty word we call out that is not met with any sound from the world. Tomorrow, we will consider this topic from another angle. In particular, we will go into more detail about what Nietzsche met with, so that we can rightly understand moral values in human life and bring them into harmony with the knowledge and outlook of our times. Taking the example of Nietzsche, who declared himself a moral philosopher, I explained yesterday that people steeped entirely in outer modern civilization will fail in their attempts to find moral impulses in the nature of the human being, because present-day knowledge does not tell us how moral impulses intervene in our physical life. On the one hand, our civilization accepts the laws of natural science, which have already influenced our education to such an extent that we absorb their interpretations of nature from childhood on. On the other hand, there is a moral worldview that stands on its own. We regard moral impulses as commandments or as standards of behavior developed through social conventions. We are unable to conceive of a close connection between ethics and our physical life. As I pointed out yesterday, Nietzsche made honesty his prime virtue, and out of his honesty and sincerity he finally reached the conclusion that human beings are only physical beings. He felt our physical life was human, all too human, and was also the basis of our morality. Because Nietzsche wanted to be honest regarding the worldview of his time, he failed in his moral philosophy. He was unable to see where morality and the physical world meet and work together. Of course, it is impossible to see this working together without entering the realm rightly called the supersensible world. We have to realize that it is only in human life that moral impulses, moral ideals, if you like, and the physical processes and functions within us come into contact. Today, the big question for us is whether the moral impulses we have remain abstract or can actually intervene in our physical organization. As I said yesterday, we can be sure that no moral impulse intervenes in the mechanism of a machine. There is no direct connection between the moral world order and machines. Consequently, when the human organism is presented as a kind of machine, as happens more and more often in the modern scientific outlook, the same then applies to us, and moral impulses are only an illusion. At best, we can hope that some being made known to us through revelation will intervene in the moral world order, reward the good, and punish the evil people. But we cannot see a connection between moral impulses and physical processes inherent in the order of the world. Today I want to talk about the realm where this connection between the physical and the moral actually exists. To help us understand what I am going to say, we will begin with animals. Their physical body, their organism of etheric formative forces, and their astral body work together. There is no real I incarnated in animals. Rather, they have a group I that intervenes from the outside. Now we must realize that we have to distinguish two main parts in the animal organization. On the one hand, there is the head. In higher animals, and also in human beings, the head is the primary bearer of the nerve sense organism. Everything the animals take in from the outer world enters their body mainly through the organs in the head. Of course, what I have emphasized so often is true here too. We should not project the organization of an organism as a whole onto one of its physical parts. In a sense, however, animals are all head, even though they can perceive with their whole body, not just the head. Their nerve sense organism is mostly located in their head. That is where their relationship to the outer world develops. When we now look at the overall organization of animals and see that the opposite pole to the head organism is the tail end, then in terms of the animal's physical, etheric, and astral organization, we can say that their astral mobility flows from the back to the front. The streams of their astral body are continuously flowing from the back to the front and meet the sensory impressions received through the sense organ in the head. Thus, the two streams merge. I can draw you a rough sketch of this here. The astral streams flowing from the back to the front are met by the sensory impressions flowing from the head toward the tail end. These two currents merge and work together throughout the animal's organism. You can see this merging clearly in dogs. Upon seeing its master, a dog wags its tail. This shows the dog received the sensory impression of its master, which flows from the front to the back, and this is now met by the astral stream. This streaming of the whole organism from the back to the front manifests in the wagging of the tail. There is complete harmony. If you want to know how joy is expressed in the physiognomy of a dog, you should not look so much at its face when it sees its master, but rather at the wagging tail. Basically, this applies to all animals. In lower species, for example in fish, we cannot see this as clearly because their astral body is more independent. However, with clairvoyant consciousness we can see it all the more clearly. Clairvoyant consciousness knows that when a fish perceives through its nerve sense apparatus that something is floating toward it, the fish sends its own astral stream from the back toward the front to meet the impression from the outside. As a result, there is a wonderful glittering merging of what the fish sees and what it brings to meet the perception. This deep meshing of the astral stream from the outside, after all, what a being receives with sensory impressions is an astral stream from the outside, and the astral stream flowing from the back to the front is interrupted in human beings because we stand upright. Because we are upright beings, we cannot send astral streams to meet our sensory impressions as directly as, for example, dogs can. Dogs have a horizontal spine. Thus, the astral stream from the back to the front goes through their head. Our head stands out, so to speak. Therefore, the relationship between the astral currents flowing from the back to the front, which are what our inner being consists of, and the other ones coming through our sensory impressions, is not as simple as it is in animals. We have to study carefully what I have just explained if we want to understand how the moral intervenes in our physical nature. We do not concede morality to animals because in them the streaming of the astral from back to front and from front to back is not interrupted at all. In human beings, however, the following occurs. Our head is lifted out of the astral current that flows from back to front. This signifies the incarnation of our I. It is because our blood flows not only horizontally but also upward as the bearer of our inner I forces, that we experience this I as our own individual I. That is also why our head, the main carrier of our sensory impressions, is at first completely focused on the outer world. Due to the way we are organized, our sense of touch is much more closely connected to that of sight than is the case in animals. When animals see something, they immediately have the feeling of touching what they are looking at. The sense of touch is stimulated by their sight. This stimulation of the sense of touch then combines with the current flowing from the back to the front. In contrast, our head is lifted above this and focused exclusively on the outer world, as is obvious above all in our sense of sight. In a way, our sense of sight is a kind of etheric sense. For example, we learn only gradually to judge distances and so on, and we mostly see what is expressed in color and shades of color. Just remember that painting in perspective was not developed until the age of intellectualism. Earlier artists did not yet paint in perspective. It was only later, by way of judgment and intellectualism, that human eyes became used to seeing the reality that is expressed in perspective, in distances. Our eyes see mostly color, contrasts, and shades of light and dark. Light covers all objects. It actually originates in the cosmos. The sun sends out its light, and since the light coming from the cosmos falls on objects on the earth and is reflected by them, our eyes actually do not see things by means of earthly forces, but only with the help of cosmic forces. This is symptomatic of our head in general. It is more open to the etheric element in the world than to the physical. We actually find our way in the physical world more by moving around in it and touching it than by using the sense organs in our head. Imagine how ghostly, how etheric ghostly the world would be if we did not find our bearings in space through our sense of touch, but had to rely only on what our eyes tell us. Animal heads are organized entirely differently from the human head. The animal's organization is much more closely connected with physical reality through the head than our organization. The perceptions of our head are like ideals because they are etheric. In fact, with our head we live completely in an etheric world. The outer shape of our head is an image of the cosmos, and this is not a mere superficiality. In contrast, the various shapes of animal heads are a direct expression of the animal's corporeality. You will not find the cosmic, rounded shape of the human head in the animal kingdom. Our head is indeed an image of the cosmic spheres. We have developed this shape because we have a vertical body axis and not a horizontal one as the animals do. In a sense, we have risen beyond the horizontal into the vertical. We can see this especially clearly when we look at our organization as a whole. The physical organization of our head is attached to an etheric organization that mirrors the purity of the cosmos. The organization of our head in the etheric body is hardly at all in contact with earthly elements throughout our life on earth. In its etheric, and even more so in its astral elements, it remains completely cosmic. In fact, when we pass on from one earthly life to the next, the rest of our bodily organization, that is the part below the head, is transformed. It undergoes a metamorphosis, not in its physical matter, but in its force constellation, and becomes the head of our next incarnation. Of course, as a system of forces, the head of our present incarnation vanishes after our death. In other words, to develop into head organization, our physical organization first has to go through the cosmos. Our head organization cannot develop on earth. Through our head we are completely open to the cosmos, but through the rest of our organization we are bound to the earthly realm. The shape of animal heads develops out of the rest of their organization. However, our head, in a sense, lifts itself with a certain amount of independence out of our organization. Now the rest of our organization pushes its way into our head in our changing gestures and facial expressions. For example, if you are inwardly agitated because you are frightened, then what is in your metabolism and blood circulation is expressed through the forces of your organism in your changing expressions and the sudden paling of your face. Other emotions affect us similarly. In other words, what lives in the rest of our organism pours soul-spiritually, that is, astrally, into our head. What lives astrally in the rest of our organism becomes manifest in our complexion and, above all, in our changing expressions, in our physiognomy, in the physiognomy and mobility of our head. It is highly interesting to observe the facial expressions accompanying what somebody is saying to us, which comes from his or her capital I. We can read in the person's face what lives in his or her astral body. If you observe the face of someone speaking to you, you receive the person's I with his or her words, and the other's astral body with the facial expressions accompanying the words. The astral organism of the head, which causes the changing features, is connected to an etheric organism, which is a wonderful image of the cosmos. It is very strange to observe with supersensible sight a person speaking. One sees the astral body making itself felt everywhere in the person's changing features, but the etheric organism of the head is hardly touched at all by the facial expressions. The etheric organism of the head refuses to assimilate the facial expressions into itself, into its forms. For instance, it is very interesting to see that certain hymns permeate a person's astral body with a feeling of holiness and are easily assimilated into the etheric organization of the head. In the process, the etheric body accompanies the facial expressions with a play of light in its facial region. However, in the parts of the etheric body that lie further back, away from the face, there the etheric body puts up a strong resistance against assimilating any processes from the changing features. This shows you that while our head is, in a way, related to the rest of our organism, this connection is governed by certain laws, because the etheric body is an image of the cosmos. It wants to maintain this shape of the cosmos and does not want to deviate from it, especially not because of what comes from the passions and instincts of human nature. Our facial expressions are contingent on our temperament, character, and various soul and physical characteristics. They are visible, but there is still another physiognomy that is even much more vivid, but it is in our unconscious. It is supersensible, and beyond the scope of our sensory perception. When you look at our astral body, in particular the part that is connected to the metabolic limb system that surrounds and permeates our legs and abdomen, you will see a very expressive physiognomy if you have supersensible perception. The strange thing is that this physiognomy is revealed from the outside in. Thus, while the physiognomy accompanying our words and expressing our interest in our surroundings is revealed on the outside, another physiognomy that we are not conscious of is revealed on the inside. I would like to explain this with a diagram. Here we have a human being. There is the astral body that causes the facial expressions visible on the outside. And here is another part of that same astral body. In the astral body up here, our physiognomy is visible on the outside, but down here in the other part, we have a physiognomy manifesting entirely on the inside. The latter part of the astral body faces toward the inside. We are usually not aware of this, but it is nevertheless true. Children continuously turn this physiognomy of the lower part of the astral body toward their inside. By the time they become adults, the expressions or features become more or less permanently turned to the inside. Now let me tell you what is behind all this. When we have an impulse to do what is rightly called a good or moral deed, our inner physiognomy is different from what it would be if we had an impulse to do something evil. We have, in a sense, an ugly physiognomy on the inside when we carry out a selfish deed. After all moral deeds are basically unselfish, and all immoral ones egotistic. However, in everyday life, this moral difference is masked by the fact that people can be very immoral, that is, full of selfish motives, but still follow a conventional code of morality. Of course, this code is not at all their own. Rather, people are stuck in what they were taught since childhood, or in doing things because they are worried about what others will say. True morality, however, that lives in the human individuality, means that our good deeds originate in our interest in other people. We can develop this interest by feeling within ourselves what others feel and experience. Basically, immorality means that we close ourselves off against the feelings of others and are unsympathetic. To have morally good thoughts is to put oneself in someone else's place. To have morally evil thoughts is to be unable to do so. This can then develop into laws and conventional rules, things people get embarrassed about, or don't. Actions that are in fact selfish can be deeply buried beneath conventions. Fundamentally, however, morality cannot be judged on the basis of what people do. We have to go deeper into the character and nature of human beings to determine the moral value of a person. Our moral value is expressed in the astral body. Its lower part turns a beautiful countenance toward the inside when unselfish deeds and impulses live in us. When selfish and evil impulses live in us, then this part of the astral body turns an ugly countenance toward the inside. Thus, when we can read with spiritual accuracy what is inside a person, we can tell by this physiognomy whether he or she is good or evil, just as we can assess people's other characteristics by their facial expressions. All this is not accessible to our usual consciousness, but it is there, nevertheless. It is impossible for dishonesty not to enter deeply into the dishonest person. Now, an out-and-out villain may have complete control over his facial expressions and have the most innocent face you can imagine while he is plotting more villainy. Yet what is in his astral body, in his inner physiognomy and features, he cannot disguise. There he turns into a regular devil the moment his immoral motives appear. On the outside, such a villain may seem as innocent as a baby, but inside he looks like a devil. As a pure egotist, he grins diabolically at his own heart. This law applies as much as the natural laws. Now, the crucial point is that when an ugly physiognomy develops down here, the head, being used to the cosmos, repels it and does not take it in. As a result, we form in our etheric a body similar to Ahriman's, its atrophied head reduced to the instinctual. Everything goes into the lower members of the etheric body. The head will not accept any of it, and we then become Ahrimanic in the lower part of our etheric body. Then our head, too, becomes permeated with what this Ahrimanic body pushes up into it. The strange thing here is that our head, already in its warmth ether, rejects the physiognomy of immorality and does not let it enter. Consequently, immoral people have an etheric Ahrimanic organism within them, but the shape and function of their head is not influenced by that. Their head is still an image of the cosmos, but it is less and less a part of them because they cannot permeate it with their own being. Immoral people do not advance far beyond their previous incarnation. Their head, developed through the transformation of the rest of their body from the preceding incarnation, remains unchanged. Thus they have not advanced much by the time they die. On the other hand, the inner effects of our moral imagination create a vertical stream up into our head. Nothing immoral can stream in the vertical direction. It is pushed back, pressed together, and makes the person Ahrimanic. Only what is moral can stream in the vertical direction. In fact, the physiognomy of the immoral is repelled in its vertical movement, already in the etheric, already in the warmth ether of the blood. Our head does not take it in. However, the moral enters our head with the warmth of the blood already in the warmth ether, and even more so in the light ether, the chemical ether, and the life ether. Then we permeate our head with our own being. What happens there is indeed an intervention of the moral in the physical organization, for we can say that our etheric head organization has an affinity for the moral in us, but not for the immoral. Of course, if we do not go beyond physical sensory perception, we cannot see how our moral impulses work into our physical organization by way of the etheric. We have to look at the human being as a whole, including the etheric and astral organization, to see how the moral intervenes in the human organism. As you can imagine, this looks different when we are dead. If our head has repelled the forces of our remaining organization, then in our etheric body, which we cast off after a few days, there will be nothing left of us. Then we cannot have much of an effect on the world, and we cannot work on the further development of the earth, because we do not send forces into what will last into the future. If we have developed moral impulses that have entered our head, then our etheric body leaves us after death in the form of a human being. The etheric body of immoral persons, on the other hand, looks completely Ahrimanic when it leaves them. We can get a good idea of the shape of Ahriman even without trying to meet Ahriman himself. We only need to look at the etheric body of immoral persons, whose form has become completely Ahrimanic, merging into the cosmos. However, the etheric body that leaves the I and the astral body of a moral individual 2 or 3 days after death will be humanized, well-rounded, and serene. Such individuals assimilate their experiences during life with their head, and through the head's resemblance to the cosmos, they can then give them to the cosmos. As I said, our head resembles the cosmos, but the rest of our organism does not. Instead, after it has been given over to the cosmos, the rest of our organism will be scattered and fall back onto the earth or enter streams that circle the earth. However, our morality that we have imprinted into our head will be poured out into the cosmos, and that is how we participate in the reshaping of the cosmos. In other words, by being moral or immoral, we actively work on the future of the earth. Immoral people present the forces surrounding the earth with what drizzles down onto the earth etherically and reunites with it, or what lives in the orbit around the earth. These surrounding forces are important for all earth activity because the physical of the earth develops eventually out of the etheric. On the other hand, moral people have taken into their head the forces that develop especially through moral impulses, and they therefore give to the cosmos what they have achieved on earth. If we remain within the limits of the earth, we cannot see how moral impulses actually work. They remain only abstractions for us. For example, consider what a moral philosopher such as Herbart says about moral impulses. He distinguishes 5 kinds of moral impulses: inner freedom, benevolence, perfection, fairness, and honesty. People living according to these 5 virtues would be moral people for Herbart. However, Herbart is unable to say anything more concrete and specific. He can only characterize an individual as moral. He cannot explain what this means for the world. Yesterday, I told you about the 4 cardinal virtues Nietzsche distinguished. His grouping is a bit different from Herbart's. Nietzsche listed honesty with oneself and one's friends, courage toward one's enemies, magnanimity toward the vanquished, and courtesy to everyone. However, all these virtues remain abstractions as long as we look at the human being only as a physical organism. In a sense, presenting people with these virtues as moral impulses is like giving an order to a machine. You can persuade and coax a machine all you want. It will not dream of accepting any of your impulses. Similarly, human beings, as they are defined by our modern worldview, cannot accept any moral impulses. To understand the reality and effectiveness of the moral, we have to enter the supersensible realm. The physiognomy turned toward the inside, the gesture turned inward, they are supersensible. Depending on whether they are moral or immoral, they are either taken in or rejected by the head, and then either flow into the cosmos or shatter on the earth, burst and are scattered everywhere. Thus even a moral philosopher with the inner force of Nietzsche is at loose ends with his moral principles. He can only solidify them in the way I described yesterday. However, that would still not be a true solidity. In spite of all his explanations in title Beyond Good and Evil, he had to trace everything to the physical body. That is why he failed. Thus, to understand the effectiveness of the moral, we have to go beyond the merely physical order of the world and enter the supersensible realm. We have to realize that while morality radiates into the physical in an abstract way, we can understand and assess its activity only in the realm of the supersensible. As I have often emphasized, intellectual life has become predominant in our time. Preparations for this began during the Fourth Post-Atlantean or Greco-Roman epoch. As you know, on the basis of certain human soul characteristics that developed during that time, we have to say that the Greco-Roman period lasted from the 8th century BC to the 15th century AD. It was followed by the period of soul development for Western humanity we live in now. The relationship of people to the intellectual world was different prior to the 15th century. Although the inclination in the mood of human souls toward intellectualism that existed in Greece has been in decline since the 4th century AD, the Greco-Roman soul mood can still be detected everywhere in the second part of the Fourth Post-Atlantean epoch. To fully understand this particular soul mood, we have to put ourselves with all our heart and mind into the ancient Greeks. This applies particularly to the special characteristics they had during the age lasting from Socrates and Plato to the decline of Hellenism. What shines through ordinary and superficial history tells us, even if we are not steeped in spiritual science, that when the ancient Greeks attained an intellectual view of the world, they felt joy, or at least satisfaction, about having advanced in their humanity. They believed that having gone through the various stages of education at that time and being able to form a world view through the power of their intellect meant they had progressed to a higher stage of humanity. They felt that they were human beings in a higher sense, when they could grasp the world intellectually. Thus there existed a complete joy and satisfaction in intellectual life. We find this also in later epochs. For example, in John Scotus Erigena, I hope I say that right, Erigena, who lived in the 9th century AD. The way he formulated and presented his ideas shows that he believed people would feel enthusiasm about understanding them. This was still very much the case with those people who tried to attain an intellectual worldview in the isolation from the world typical of scholasticism, even though by then their discussions had become less heated. It is only in these last few centuries that people have begun believing they will lose their soul warmth when they become intellectual. As recently as the time of Schiller and his intellectual worldview, or of Goethe and his extraordinarily exact morphology, things were quite different. People such as these two great personalities developed an idealistic intellectual worldview and believed they were not truly human until they could bring inner warmth into their ideas. It is only quite recently that people have begun to perceive the world of ideas as cold and pale. In accordance with an important law in human evolution, people's relationship to the world of intellectually formed ideas has changed drastically. In earlier times, the world of ideas was concerned with life and the living. People believed the cosmos was alive. True insight into ancient concepts and thoughts reveals that people back then saw everything that was dead as a kind of precipitate of the living substance they believed to be spread out over the whole world. In other words, what was dead was regarded like the ashes that are left over when something is burned. In those days, people had a very different feeling about the universe than we do. To them, the universe was a big, living organism, and everything that was dead, for example, the mineral realm, was like the ashes that precipitated out from the world processes. It was dead because it was a waste product, or residue, of everything living. This feeling about the world has changed tremendously over the last few centuries. Scientific knowledge is highly respected, or at least it has usually been highly respected, as long as the scientist expounded only on what is dead. And increasingly, people have felt the longing to see life itself as only a chemical combination of dead elements. Thus the idea of the spontaneous generation of life out of dead matter developed. As I have often explained, the medieval representation of homunculus in a retort is a being made up of various ingredients. Let me read that again, I'm sorry. As I have often explained, the medieval representation of homunculus in a retort is a being made up of various ingredients, as a being made up of various ingredients, was not meant as a picture of spontaneous generation, in the sense recent natural scientists use that term. Rather, this representation was intended to depict the conjuring forth of a particular living creature out of the indefinite living universe. People then did not yet conceive of the universe as a mechanism, as something dead, and that is why they believed it was possible to bring forth a particular living being out of the indefinite life of the world. People in the Middle Ages did not yet think of combining dead elements to create life. Without spiritual science, these things are hard to understand nowadays, because people have gotten used to thinking their concepts have become perfect and absolutely right after having passed through various childhood stages of humanity. We can talk about modern progress all we want. It is still true that people have never been as rigid in their concepts and thoughts as they are now. It is ultimately a subjective element that makes people so rigid, particularly in their understanding and knowledge. What is dead remains entirely passive when we apply our ideas and concepts to it. Thus we can develop our concepts quite nicely and comfortably, for the dead element is not going to object or resist. We can then apply our concepts about the physical world to nature, without being bothered by the fact that nature itself, in its living flexibility, challenges us to be just as flexible in our concepts. Goethe still felt that our concepts had to be inwardly alive, without sharply defined contours. Only then can our concepts adapt and adjust to the living, flexible world, and to living and flexible beings. To put it in a somewhat paradoxical way, people nowadays prefer their concepts to be convenient. However, rigid concepts with sharply defined contours can be applied only to what is dead and does not budge, thus allowing our concepts to remain rigid. Nevertheless, living in rigid concepts that ignore everything living has given us the opportunity to attain an inner awareness of freedom, as I have often explained. Two developments have come about as a result of our concepts having become dead. First, the awareness of freedom, and second, the possibility to apply the rigid concepts, which have been developed out of what is dead and can be used only for what is dead in our magnificent, triumphant technology, which is nothing more than the putting into practice of a rigid system of ideas. This is one aspect of the evolution modern humanity has undergone. We have to understand how human beings, in a sense, have cut themselves off from everything living, that the living has become alien to them. And we also have to understand that when we do not want to remain in the realm of the dead, but want to take the impulse of the living into our soul, then we must find this living element on our own. In very ancient times, people saw life in every cloud formation, every flash of lightning, every roll of thunder, in every living plant, and so on. In a sense, they breathed in life and thus understood it, and without any effort, they were in the midst of life. They only had to take in life from the outside. In contrast, in our evolutionary stage, our concepts can grasp only what is dead, and the outer environment can no longer give us what is alive. Therefore, we must bring forth this living element out of the innermost core of our being. It is not enough to understand history merely theoretically, with our intellect, for then history appears much too uniform and unvarying. We have to put ourselves with all our soul into the way people in past epochs experienced history. Then we will see what a tremendous change took place between the pre-Grecian ages, which we trace back to Atlantean times in our anthroposophy, that is, to the 7th and 8th millennia BC, the Greek age, and our own time. Today I would like to talk concretely and in detail about this change in people's attitudes toward the universe. I want to describe this change from the vantage point of spiritual vision. In early history, for example, in the Egyptian or the Babylonian Chaldean culture, or even in the ancient Persian culture, people believed they had descended to earth from a pre-earthly life. They felt they were bearing within them the after effects of what the gods had implanted in them during this pre-earthly life. Of course, ordinary history tells us only very little about these times. We need to use the methods of spiritual science to penetrate and understand these things. In those times, people expressed their relationship to the earth by saying, "Here I stand on earth. Before this I was in a soul spiritual world, a world of light, so to speak. That light continues to shine mysteriously within me. In a sense, as a human being, I am a vessel for the divine light that continues to live within me." In other words, people were aware that a divine element had come down to earth with them. They did not say, and this can be proved philologically, "I stand upon the earth," but they said, "As a human being, I am a vessel for the God who has come to the earth." That is what was in people's consciousness in early history. In fact, the further back we go in evolution, the more prevalent is the awareness that the human being is a vessel for the God who has descended to earth. The divine element then was manifold. To the ancient consciousness, the lowest gods in the divine hierarchy that extended all the way down to the earth were the human beings themselves. If we do not present a distorted picture of Oriental culture as Deussen has done in such a terrible superficial way, but really try to sympathize with the consciousness of the ancient Indians when they felt their Brahma within them, felt themselves enveloping it, then we will understand what human soul life in ancient times was really like. Out of this consciousness developed the feelings people had for the Divine Father, the Father God. People felt themselves to be, in a sense, the sons and daughters of the gods. They did not feel this way about their physical body, but only about what this physical body enveloped. Some people in ancient times thought that our flesh and blood indeed was not worthy to be a vessel for a god. Thus it was not the human being of flesh and blood that they regarded as divine, but the part that projected from the spiritual world into this physical earthly human being, into the human being of flesh and blood. People felt their relationship to the Father God was a religious one. The highest rank in the ancient mysteries was that of Father. In most Oriental mysteries, the candidates had to advance through 7 stages. The first stage was one of preparation. Here the candidates had to develop the soul mood that would enable them to understand what was shown to them in the mysteries. In the second, through the 4th stages, the candidates achieved a full understanding of their folk soul. As a result, they no longer felt themselves to be isolated individuals, but members of a group or community. As they advanced to the 5th and 6th stages, the candidates felt themselves more and more to be vessels of the divine element. The highest stage was that of the Father. The candidates who reached this stage were personalities who represented in their outer life what people felt to be the divine primordial principle to which they really felt connected. Their culture was completely determined by the center of their religious life. People had to consciously feel a relationship to the divine, fatherly, creative principle. Accordingly, people felt everything they could understand within themselves. For example, the light of knowledge that they could become aware of as bequeathed upon them by God the Father. They felt God the Father continuing to work in their intellect. All their cults were shaped by this, as they were simply reflections of the path of knowledge the candidates took in the mysteries. Then came the age of Greek antiquity. The ancient Greeks were the purest representative of the stage of humanity that developed out of the soul conditions I have just described. The Greeks thought of themselves more as human beings than as mere vessels of the divine. Nevertheless, their feeling about themselves was such that those who had undergone any education, let's say intellectual, artistic, or religious training, felt that the divine had completely entered into the human being, without remainder, so to speak. Thus they no longer thought of themselves as vessels of a god, but rather as representations of him. However, this was not expressed as openly as the other soul condition had been in earlier times. In ancient Greece, it was revealed only to mystery candidates at a certain stage of initiation that as human beings they were also divine beings, sons of the gods. In fact, it was considered impossible to present this mystery of the origins of humanity to people who were unprepared. Nevertheless, this was how the initiated Greeks thought, and thus it was the fundamental feeling of their culture. It was not a sharply defined idea, but a basic feeling of the soul. This basic feeling is expressed in Greek art, where the gods are represented as idealized human beings in accordance with that fundamental feeling. In a sense, then, the ancient Greeks kept their relationship to the divine in the purity of their heart and feelings. Now, when the Greek worldview was well into its decline, a totally new soul mood appeared with the 15th century. People no longer thought of themselves as earthly vessels of the divine or as representations of the divine. Instead, they saw themselves as having evolved through lower imperfect stages into human beings, beings who can only look up to the otherworldly divine. The natural sciences of modern times are based on this fundamental feeling. But we have not yet been able to understand how these sciences are related to ourselves. It is the task of anthroposophy to help us find once again this relationship to ourselves and to the divine. This refinding can be accomplished in the following way. Imagine what people in pre-Grecian ages felt in their soul. They would have felt that they enveloped a divine element. By enveloping the divine with their flesh and blood, they could not help but represent it on earth in less than its true dignity and glory. In a sense, they could not help degrading it. In order to represent the divine element within them in all its purity, they had to purify themselves. They had to undergo a kind of catharsis or purification, so that the divine within them would be the predominating element. Basically, this is nothing else than a return to the fatherly primordial principle, as we see it in many religions of antiquity, where people believed that after death they would return to their ancestors, even their remote ancestors. In all religions there is this longing to return to the Divine Father's primordial creative principle. It indicates that human beings did not yet feel at home on earth. At the same time, they did not yet see themselves as completely separate from God and moving longingly toward the otherworldly divine out of this position of separateness. Rather, people in those early times strove to represent the human being in all his purity, because they believed God would then come to light. All this changed in Greek antiquity. People then no longer felt as closely connected with the Divine Father principle as they had in earlier times. They still felt connected to the divine, but at the same time also to the earthly realm. In a sense, people back then felt themselves to be equally close to the divine and to the earthly. This was the age in which the mystery of Golgotha took place. It was the epoch when, in addition to saying, quote, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God," unquote, referring to the Father God, quote, "and the Word was God," unquote, John 1:1, people had to say, quote, "and the Word became flesh," John 1:14. The Word, or Logos, had originally been regarded only as the union with the Father God, but now people believed that the Word had fully taken up his abode within human beings. People had to seek him within themselves. The mystery of Golgotha fit in very well with this mood of soul. People had never been able to think of God the Father in human form. He had to be thought of purely spiritually. Christ, the Son of God, was conceived of as divine and human at the same time. Basically, what the ancient Greeks longed for or realized in their art was fulfilled for all of humanity in the mystery of Golgotha in its entirety. We must not be distracted by trivialities, but must concentrate on the essentials, namely the fact that a divine being has entered human beings here on earth. This makes the mystery of Golgotha the center of human evolution on earth. It is certainly no mere coincidence that the mystery of Golgotha took place at the time when the ancient Greeks tried to represent the divine element in human beings from the outside, from the point of view of the earth. It is not just a poetic metaphor to say that in ancient Greek art, God was represented as a human being with the ingredients available on earth. And the cosmos sent God down into the human being in order to answer the wonderful question ancient Greek civilization had sent out into the universe, as it were. From human historical development we get the feeling that with their human representations of the gods, the ancient Greeks were asking the cosmos whether God could become human. And the cosmos answered that God could become human by letting the mystery of Golgotha take place. I have often emphasized that we cannot understand this mystery of Golgotha in its true essence when we approach it only with the knowledge about dead things that has become so widespread recently. Rather, we must approach it with a new, living way of knowing, a way of knowing that is permeated by spirit. Then we will have to realize that we have achieved our consciousness of freedom as well as our technological progress with the help of our dead concepts. However, we cannot stop with this inner condition of death. Out of our own soul, we must develop the impulse of something living, something alive and spiritual. In other words, we must be able to have ideas that are inwardly alive. These ideas must take hold not only of our intellect, but of our whole being. As I indicated in my book titled Goethe's Conception of the World, we have to be able, once again, to advance beyond dead and abstract concepts to a spirituality that will fill us with ideas. Into this world of ideas we must then bring all living warmth that can glow in our soul, and all bright light that can arouse the enthusiasm of our soul. We must become able once again to take up into the realm of ideas all our soul warmth and all our soul light. We must become able to inwardly take our whole being with us into the spirituality of the world of ideas. This ability is what we have lost in our time. There is probably hardly anything in modern literature as deeply moving as the first chapter in Nietzsche's presentation of Greek philosophy in the tragic age of the Greeks, as he called it. Nietzsche describes the philosophers of the pre-Socratean age, among them Thales, Heraclitus, and Anaxagoras. If you have a sense for this and have an open mind, you will be very moved by Nietzsche's description of how, at a certain point in their development, the ancient Greeks rose to the abstraction of pure being. They moved from the manifoldness of the impressions of nature that had filled them with warmth to the pale thought of being. Roughly, Nietzsche said the following: "You feel chilly. You feel you enter icy regions as you follow an ancient Greek philosopher, for example Parmenides, to this abstract idea of all-embracing being." Nietzsche felt transported from the modern culture, in which he was thoroughly steeped, as I explained here the day before yesterday, into the glacier region of the soul. In fact, Nietzsche failed because he could only go as far as the coldness, the glacial nature of the world of ideas. Clairvoyance in true spirituality, however, can bring both soul warmth and soul light into intellectuality. As a result, we can achieve the purity in our concepts I have described, entitled The Philosophy of Freedom. This purity in our concepts makes us not into inwardly dried up, but rather inwardly enthusiastic human beings. We become able to feel the sun warmth of the cosmos through the cold regions of intellectualism as we leave behind the earthly warmth of the sensory world. We become able to receive the cosmic light through carrying our living soul impulses into the darkness that grows within us as we leave behind the shining earthly objects and enter the world of intellectual concepts. In other words, we become human beings who have overcome the earthly darkness. Everywhere in Nietzsche's work we can see his longing for this cosmic light and this cosmic warmth. But he could not reach them, and that is why he failed. Anthroposophy wants to show us the way that does not lead to a loss of earth warmth and earth light, but to the preservation of our lively interest in every concrete earthly detail. In other words, we can retain our loving attachment to all earthly things, and yet rise to the level of concepts where the divine reveals itself in pure concepts. We modern people can no longer feel the divine element within us, as ancient people still could. We must work to reach the divine realm. This mood enables us to get the right feeling for the mystery of the Holy Spirit. Indeed, this is the difference between the spiritual life of modern and ancient people. In ancient times, people drew their spirituality from the many beings of nature. Clouds spoke to them of the Spirit, and so did the flowers. In contrast, our concepts have grown cold and dead, and we must bring them to life by ourselves. Only then can we approach the Holy Spirit, who will help us to understand the mystery of Golgotha in the right way. We take something of our humanity with us when we imbue our ideas with soul warmth and soul light through anthroposophy. If we did not do this, we could not go beyond the dry, banal, and abstract aspect of the world of ideas. When we achieve an understanding of the world through the insights I have explained in my anthroposophical books, then our ideas remain just as exact as they are in mathematics or in the other sciences. Our thinking will be no less exact than that of the chemist in his laboratory or the biologist in his study, but our concepts require that we bring something of ourselves to them. When anthroposophists speak out of imagination or inspiration, and people really understand them based on their sound common sense, then they will see this imagination or inspiration as clearly before them as mathematicians see their equations or geometrical figures. But people must bring something of their humanity with them, or they will not understand these ideas in the right way. What they must bring with them is love. We cannot acquire the knowledge anthroposophy gives us without permeating it with love. Without love, it has no more significance than anything else. It makes no difference whether you classify beings, as the materialistic scientists do, into marsupials, anthropoid apes, ape men, and human beings, or whether you say human beings consist of physical body, etheric body, astral body, and I. Granted, they are different thoughts, but the state of the soul is the same in both cases. The condition of our soul will change only when our spiritual understanding of our place in nature becomes inwardly alive. It can change only when the same feeling, perception, and soul conditions that live in love also accompany the act of knowing. When we permeate our knowledge with the experience of love, then our knowledge can approach the mystery of Golgotha. Then we will have more than the naive leaning toward Christ, which in principle is perfectly justified. We will also have a knowledge that extends over the whole cosmos and that can be deepened into an understanding of the mystery of Golgotha. In other words, life in the Holy Spirit leads to living in Christ, the Son of God. There, we will come to realize that through the mystery of Golgotha, the Logos has passed from the Father to the Son. Then the important insight will be revealed to us that it was right for people in ancient times to say, "In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God." But in Greek antiquity, people had to begin saying, "And the Logos was made flesh." And we modern people must add, "I must achieve an understanding of the Logos living in the flesh by raising my concepts and ideas, my whole world view into the spiritual realm. Then I will find Christ through the Holy Spirit, and through Christ I will find the Father God." This is definitely not just a theory, but something we can experience directly. This attitude toward Christianity is a natural outgrowth of anthroposophy. Indeed, it is essential for us in our time to understand such a spiritual path. We need this understanding precisely to counterbalance the dead culture that consists of modern life's mechanism, which we must not disparage but highly appreciate. However, for us modern people to enter upon this spiritual path requires an inner jolt. I have recently called it a true awakening, and many people do not want to make that effort. It is this unwillingness to make the effort of the jolt in one's soul that causes the present-day opposition to anthroposophy. After all, experiencing this jolt is somewhat uncomfortable. In a sense, this jolt pulls us into the maelstrom of cosmic becoming. Of course, people prefer to remain peacefully with their rigid, sharply defined concepts that apply only to what is dead, to what does not put up any resistance to their understanding of the world. In contrast, what is living resists being comprehended with dead concepts. It moves around and eludes our concepts. Modern people find that feeling uncomfortable. They clothe it in all kinds of other things, and they get furious when they hear that certain circles want a very different understanding of the world in all areas of life. It is only on the basis of this attitude that we can understand the peculiar developments among the opponents of anthroposophy. We need only mention a few of the most recent developments, and you will clearly see how peculiar they are. First, there is the tragedy of the loss of our Goetheanum. We know very well that no matter what we can do in the way of rebuilding, the old Goetheanum will not appear again. It will remain only a memory. It is really very painful to have to realize that we tried with our Goetheanum to find the kind of artistic style appropriate for the new spirituality, one that would have a stimulating effect, and that with the Goetheanum that style is now, at least for the time being, completely gone. We need only express this realization to feel the tremendous pain the loss of the Goetheanum has brought. Usually when tragedy strikes, one's opponents stop being disrespectful and scornful. However, after the tragedy of the burning of the Goetheanum, our opponents think it justified and proper to oppose us with even more scorn and derision. That is indeed peculiar, and it fits inappropriately, though it is of course inappropriate, with so many other things. The anthroposophical movement began as a purely positive activity. We did not attack anybody, nor did we agitate. We just talked about the results of anthroposophical research. We calmly waited until the souls that are present on earth in our time would come to us out of their own inner impulses in order to understand what was to be conveyed out of the spiritual world. Our anthroposophical work was aimed not at wildly agitating, nor at drawing up programs, but at simply telling how things are according to our researches in the spiritual world. We were waiting to see which souls had a yearning for knowledge of reality. Many people nowadays are against anthroposophy without knowing why. They simply follow the lead of others. However, there are also a few people who know very well why they are against anthroposophy. They realize that anthroposophy reveals truths that require the jolt I described earlier. That is something they do not want. There are many reasons why they do not want it. For example, such truths used to be restricted to certain small circles. The possession of these truths then allowed people in those circles to stand above humanity as a kind of small spiritual and aristocratic elite. That is why such people hate especially those who bring the truth the spirit of the times requires out of the spiritual world and make it available to everyone. At the same time, our opponents, I am talking about the leading ones, know that nothing can be done against the truth itself. They know it will find its way through even the narrowest crevices, regardless of the obstacles it might meet. Therefore our opponents do not usually try to fight these truths head-on, for they know the latter would undoubtedly triumph. Just look at our opponents, and it would be a good thing if we anthroposophists looked at them much more often. They refrain from fighting truths openly by focusing mainly on personal attacks, insinuations, insults, and slander. They figure they cannot do anything against the truth, but nevertheless they want to do away with it. They think they can do this through personal disparagement. The method of fighting us shows that our leading opponents know very well how to go about achieving a temporary victory. This is what anthroposophists need to know, for many anthroposophists still believe that they can accomplish something by simply discussing things with our opponents. Nothing can harm us more than to succeed in getting our truths across in discussions, for we are not hated for telling falsehoods, but for telling the truth. In fact, the more we succeed in proving we tell the truth, the more we will be hated. Of course, this cannot stop us from standing up for the truth, but it can keep us from holding on to the naive belief that we will accomplish anything through discussions. The only thing that will help us make headway is positive work. We will make headway if we keep standing up for the truth as forcefully as we can, so that as many predestined souls as possible, there are many more in our time than one usually thinks, find their way to us, and find here the spiritual nourishment they need, if something constructive is to be done for the future evolution of humanity, if our future is to be an upward development rather than a regression. It is not possible to find a way out of the chaos of our time through materialist methods. The only way to overcome the chaos of our time is the spiritual way. However, we can enter on this spiritual path only if we choose the Spirit as our leader and guide. Indeed, what anthroposophists must realize and understand in the most profound sense is how to choose the Spirit as their leader in the right way.